Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today we have Ralph Ellis. And Ralph, if you can talk to us about the similarities between Saul in the Bible and Josephus.
Yes, good to be back with you again on Esoteric. And yes, this is a very contentious subject. This is the one I get most people disagreeing with or complaining about. And I think often because they don't understand the full evidence and ramifications of the work that I've put together on this. So this comes from my King Jesus book, which was followed by Jesus, King of Edessa. And this was rather central to all of my New Testament work, because I originally did this in my book, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, which came out in 1997. So this is 25 years ago. And I just knew there had to be a connection between Saul and Josephus at that stage, even when I hadn't fully fleshed out the story. But anyway, I put it in as a chapter and said, look, you know, there's all these connections between these two people. They have to be the same person. But in doing so, that changes the story. It changes the dates. It changes many things, for which I got a lot of criticism for. But then I went back in my King Jesus book and covered all of those points that people had made, answered all of those questions. And it became even more solid than it was before. So what are the connections between Saul and Josephus? Saul is St. Paul, of course, and Josephus is Josephus Flavius, the chronicler of first century Judaic history. And why should there be such a conflation? Let's start at the beginning. They were both Jews, which always helps. So all we're doing here is narrowing down the number of people who could be associated with each other. They were both Jews. They were both raised in Jerusalem. Saul being raised at the feet of Gamaliel, Acts 22:3. They both had Roman citizenship, Acts 22:27. They were both educated as Pharisees, Acts 23:6. They both became rabbis, 1 Timothy 2:7. And for Josephus, you can look at Life 15 or Life 12 or Life 7. They both had short hair. Now, this is important because, of course, the majority of Jews would have had long hair and beards in the classical sort of Jesus style. But Saul and Josephus were both pro-Roman and therefore probably did not. And we know this from Saul because he says in 1 Corinthians 11:14, does nature not teach that long hair is shameful on a man? So quite obvious to write that sort of verse. He was against having long hair and would have had short hair in the sort of Roman fashion. And Josephus likewise disparages long hair. What does he say? He says, when any have made a sacred vow, I mean those that are called the Nazarites, that they suffer their hair to grow long. So the Nazarites are the Nazarene from the first century. And he's saying that the Nazarene suffer their hair to grow long. And Jesus was a Nazarene, of course, as we've spoken about before. And so he would have had long hair, just as the images of the Edessan monarchs and Jesus portray. But Josephus is saying that they suffer this. And again, to write that, it's indicating that Josephus did not have long hair. Otherwise, he wouldn't write it in that fashion. And they were both against circumcision. We have that from Corinthians, where Saul says that he's saying, why do they make such a fuss about circumcision? If they like circumcision so much, they might as well cut their penis off and have done with it. Clearly, the Saul character was against circumcision. And there are several passages within Josephus that indicate that he was also against circumcision. And that would be unusual for a Jew, of course. We're now narrowing this right down. We've got a Jew who doesn't have long hair and is against circumcision. A very strange Jew indeed. And of course, there weren't many people like that. And of course, we know that Saul was, because he became the apostle to the Gentiles. And so he was rather non-Jewish. And Josephus was more or less the same. He worked for Rome later on. And we have some more points. So Saul was working with the Jerusalem authorities against the Jewish revolutionaries during the Jewish revolt, pursuing them around Galilee and persecuting and imprisoning their followers. And we'll have a look at this in more detail in a minute. But Josephus did exactly the same, because Josephus was appointed as the army commander in charge of Galilee. And he was pursuing Jewish revolutionaries around Galilee and committing them to prison. So from Acts, that's Acts 8:3, if you want to have a look at that. So again, we have this very close similarity between the Saul character and the Josephus character. And they both had a flash of inspiration and changed sides. As you know, Saul had a vision of a man telling him the error of his ways, and he turned to the side. He had a flash of inspiration on the road to Damascus, and he turned, changed sides and turned to the side of the rebels, to the Nazarene of Jesus and James. Well, Josephus had exactly the same. He had a flash of inspiration at Jotapata and changed sides and became a Roman in more or less the same sort of fashion. They both traveled widely in Europe and came back to Jerusalem. They were both controversial characters because they were both stoned or attacked by their opponents on many occasions because their teachings were radical. Saul being the apostle to the Gentiles, of course. They both went to see Nero on a prison ship. So they were both shipped out on a prison ship to plead their case before Nero. This was in about AD 60. Let me think about this, AD 62 or AD 63. Now, trying to narrow this down, of course, how many Jews are sent off on a prison ship to go and see Nero in the early AD 60s? Not many, I would imagine. And yet both of these characters were on this ship going to see Nero. And the ship was wrecked in both cases. There was a shipwreck and they had to swim for their life. And in one of them, in Acts of the Apostles, it says that the ship was wrecked on Malta. But most of the crew, I think all of the crew, in fact, were saved, including both Saul and Josephus. And they were both taken to Naples and then on to Rome to go and see Nero. So how many Jewish priests are shipwrecked en route to Rome and then go to see Nero? Not very many, I would say. Both of them were inveterate letter writers. They all write letters to communities across the Mediterranean, and Josephus does the same. He's advertising his books and texts that he's written, and he says he wrote at least 60 letters to communities around Europe, very much the same as Saul does. And both of them had what I call a publisher who was called Epaphroditus. And that comes from Philippians 4:23 or 2:25, where Epaphroditus is called the companion in the works of labor with Saul Paul. But of course, the publisher of the works of Josephus, who he thanks on many occasions, was Epaphroditus. And I would suggest that this is the same Epaphroditus because this is actually the same person. And this Epaphroditus lived all the way up until the AD 90s, I think it was, when he got into trouble with Domitian, one of the emperors, one of the Flavian emperors. Why did Josephus have this companion in his works? Well, he tells us that his Greek was not very good, and he found it very difficult to translate these books into Greek because he wrote them in Aramaic. And so Epaphroditus was a partner in the works of labor, as he says, because he was translating these books into Greek, because they were translated in the AD 70s from Aramaic into Greek. And of course, it's only the Greek ones we have. We don't have the original Aramaic copies. So, okay, well, here we have another comparison between these two characters, because if we have this conflation of characters, it's all very well saying that, okay, these two characters are very similar and therefore they could be the same person, which is true. But what we want is for this conflation to make sense. If the resulting conflation conflicts with everything else in the story, then there's no point having the conflation. For it to make any sense, it needs to make sense of not just the story, but things we didn't understand previously. And I think this conflation does indeed make sense of things that we didn't understand before. And the first of those is why Saul, or even how Saul, was chasing Jesus around Galilee. We have this story from the Acts of the Apostles, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He was chasing Jesus around Galilee in the AD 50s stroke 60s. In the gospel story, of course, Jesus has to be dead at this time. But anyway, they still have this quote of Jesus saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul himself was persecuting the, I won't call them the Christians because they weren't Christians, they were the Nazarene Jews. And Saul says, well, actually the Apostles says, Saul made havoc on the church, entering into every house and committing them to prison. And in the I section of Acts of the Apostles, when he's talking about himself, he says, I persecuted them unto death, binding and delivering men and women into prison. Acts 22:4. The other one was Acts 8:3. But under what authority was Saul arresting people? How was he given that authority? How could he put people in prison? How can he persecute them unto death? They had laws in those countries. So how was Saul just running around Galilee imprisoning these people? It doesn't say. And as we'll see in a minute, Saul was called a tent maker. How was a tent maker persecuting people and throwing them into prison? It doesn't say. But if Saul was Josephus Flavius, then we know exactly how he was doing this, because Josephus Flavius was the army commander in command of Galilee. And he was indeed persecuting a guy called Jesus all around Galilee in the AD 60s. That was Jesus of Gamala Saphias, the rebel leader of 600 rebel fishermen. And so the story in Acts of the Apostles makes no sense. But if we manage to conflate Saul with Josephus, it makes every sense, because he was the army commander and his job was to persecute Jesus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? The only difference between these two stories is that the Jesus character was alive in the AD 60s, because he was a leader of the Jewish revolt, because Jesus of Gamala Saphias was blamed for leading the Jewish revolt. And so this conflation of Josephus now is Josephus with Saul is explaining things that were not explained before. And it also explains why, because they were both thrown into prison. I didn't mention that before, did I? At some point, they were both thrown into prison, both Saul and Josephus. Josephus misses 7 years of his life and then says he was on this prison ship being sent to Rome. But in the Sauline accounts from Acts of the Apostles, why does it say that the governors of Judea and the kings of Judea came to see Saul while he was in prison? He was supposed to be a tent maker. So why did Festus come to him and take his point of view? He was being instructed by Saul. And eventually Festus couldn't understand any of this. And he said, Saul's great learning, 24. And then Felix came to see Saul in prison. And he was looking for a bribe to release himself from prison. Acts 24:26. Now, why would a governor of Judea come to see a tent maker in prison? Because he was thinking he would get a nice fat bribe from this guy. Clearly, the Saul character was aristocratic and he was rich. Otherwise, governors would not come expecting a bribe. You don't get a bribe off an artisan. You only get a bribe off an aristocrat. And so Saul was an aristocrat. And Agrippa II, he was the king of Judea, and Berenike, they both came to see Saul in prison. Again, a king coming to see a tent maker, it doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense if we conflate Saul with Josephus, because Josephus was an aristocrat and he was a man of great learning. That's why Festus said that his great learning was driving him mad. Joseph was the first of the 24 priestly courses, and he was of royal blood. He was royal, I think, on his mother's side from the Hasmoneans. And we know he was a man of great learning because he wrote his own secular version of the Torah and Tanakh. His position in life and his great wisdom, I suppose you might say, as a sage of the era, it concurs very well with the Josephus character. And these explanations in Acts of the Apostles only make sense if Saul was Josephus. And that's why he was sent to Nero. Why would Nero be deciding the fate of a tent maker? Makes no sense at all. Nero would be writing back to the governors of Judea and saying, you must be abject idiots over there sending me a tent maker. Judge the case yourself. Why was Saul being sent to Nero to decide his fate? He had to be aristocratic. He had to be rich and wealthy. And he was, because he was linked to the Edessan royal family. And we have that again from Acts of the Apostles. And that's the little section on Agabus. So I better quote this one, I think. So this comes from Acts 11:28. And it says, one of them, a prophet, one of them named Agabus, prophesied that there would be a great famine throughout all of the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. This is the famine that was supposed to be in AD 47-48. And the disciples of Jesus determined to send relief to the brothers in Judea, financial relief. They ended up sending corn and figs and dates and things of that to Judea to alleviate the famine. So there's the disciples determined to send relief to the brothers in Judea and sent it by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. Now, this is interesting because this Agabus, we know about this famine, and we know about this famine relief because we get stories about it in other books, in Josephus and Moses of Cyrene and various other chroniclers. And that famine relief was given by Queen Helena of Adiabene, Edessa. And we know she came from Edessa because Moses of Cyrene says that Queen Helena was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. So this money that was being given in this account in Acts of the Apostles was being given by King Abgarus and Queen Helena of Edessa. And so it's quite obvious that the Agabus they're talking about in this gospel story is Abgarus. They've changed the name because they've made it derogatory, because Agabus means locust, and they call these Edessan monarchs, they called them locusts because they didn't like them, and they destroyed Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple during the Jewish revolt, and so they called them locusts. So here in Acts of the Apostles, we have an account of King Abgarus. Sorry, I'll say it again. King Abgarus, you see how the name changes, sending famine relief to Judea, which we have other accounts of. But the interesting thing is it says that this money was sent by the hands of Barnabas and Saul, St. Paul. Now that's very interesting because it means that Saul was not only linked to the Edessan monarchy up in Edessa, he was also the ambassador of Edessa. And he was taking, with Barnabas, he was taking this money down to Judea. Saul was an Edessan ambassador. And this is interesting because it means, again, he was a very important person. He was an aristocrat. He was rich and wealthy, just the same as Josephus was. And this, if we continue with this, this explains why he was called a tent maker. So why do we have this important person, Saul, who was called a tent maker? Well, he wasn't a tent maker. He was a Sukkot maker. What is a Sukkot? Well, it's from the festival of Sukkot, the festival of tents, which is a reenactment of the tabernacle on the Exodus. And within this festival, the Jews, they all make tents. and they stay in their tents for 2 or 3 days during this festival period. And it just so happens that Queen Helena of Edessa was well known for having the largest Sukkot or tent in the whole of Judea. And so it's pretty obvious that Saul, being an ambassador of the Edessan monarchy, was a Sukkot maker, not a tent maker. He was the Sukkot maker and ambassador to the Edessan royal family. And of course, nobody will mention this because it changes the story somewhat. Suddenly we have this Saul character being not only rich, powerful, and influential, he was also an Edessan ambassador, and therefore an Edessan prince of some nature, linked somehow to the Edessan royal family. So again, we're managing through this association with Josephus, we're managing to explain things which were not, which were inexplicable before. And we get another one. Now, this one's slightly more complex, but it's building up on what we've just looked at. So within Acts of the Apostles, after Judas Iscariot is killed, dies, whatever, they have an election for a new disciple. And the contenders for that election are Joseph Barsabbas and Matthias Barnabas. But in the different gospels that we have, the different gospel manuscripts, as denoted by Adam Clarke, the 19th century theologian, he says that many of the manuscripts don't say Barsabbas, they say Barnabas. And so the two contenders for the position of disciple were Joseph Barnabas and Matthias Barnabas. They had the same surname, which sort of suggests that they might be brothers, Joseph and Matthias. Okay, so who are the two famous brothers called Josephus and Matthias? Yeah, it was Josephus Flavius and his brother Matthias. And of course, if we have this character now who is so intimately linked with the gospel story, if Josephus is Saul, then, well, we have an election here between Josephus Flavius and his brother Matthias, who wanted to become the next disciple of Jesus. But of course, the Joseph character was not elected. His brother was, Matthias, who then promptly drops out of the story in Acts of the Apostles, and we don't hear anything of him. Why? Well, because that caused a contention between these two brothers. Because remember, the brother is being called Barnabas. Now, who did Saul go with on his trips around the Mediterranean and on this famine relief down to Judea? He went on each occasion with Barnabas, who was probably his brother, Matthias Barnabas, who was the brother of Josephus. And now we have this family connection, and we can begin to understand why these two brothers were going together. Matthias was the elder brother. We know that from the epistles, where Barnabas is called Jupiter and Saul is called the fiery little Mercury. So it's quite clear that Matthias was the elder brother here. But this also explains the contention between Saul and Barnabas. So after they came back from their first tour of the Mediterranean, they had a contention, an argument between Saul and Barnabas. And it was such a big argument that Saul split from Matthias Barnabas. He wouldn't talk to him again. And he went off on his second tour with Silas. We don't know why. We're not told why they had this contention. But of course, if they had just had this election for the position of disciple, and Saul-Josephus had been rejected, then, well, yeah, I think we begin to understand why they had this contention and this split between these two brothers. And then they went their own separate ways. It's making sense of a story which did not sort of make much sense before. And so this is one of the reasons why I think that this conflation between Saul and Josephus is correct. And so, yeah, it's explanatory. It's telling us a great deal about these characters, which we didn't really understand before. And what else can we have as an explanation? Well, it explains the crucifixion. We've been through that Josephus Flavius was the guy who took Jesus down from the cross. It explains an element in Arthurian legend. People don't like me using Arthurian legend for analyzing the Gospels, because they say it's fictional, it was written much later, and it has nothing to do with the story. However, Arthurian legend came out of the Crusades. So it came back in 1135, just after the First Crusade, with the Knights Templar. And of course, remember, the First Crusade didn't go to Jerusalem, it went to Edessa. So we're back to Edessa again, this important city that was at the heart of Nazarene Judaism. Because remember, when these disciples were all going up to Antioch, as it said with the famine relief money, they were going to Antioch. That was probably not the Antioch that is suggested. So in normal history, that is said to be Antioch Arons, which is modern Antakya. It's now in Anatolia. It's on the northeast tip of the Mediterranean. There's a city there called Antakya. That's the Antioch that everyone suggests that the disciples were going to. I don't think it was. I think it was Antioch Edessa, because Edessa was called Antioch, which is further east by about 200 kilometers further east than Antakya. And so they were going to Edessa. And of course, the First Crusade went to Edessa. It didn't even go to Antakya, first of all, it went to Edessa. And so these crusaders were picking up information from Edessa, which had not been seen for 600, 700 years. It had been hidden away behind the veil of the Council of Chalcedon and the Islamic invasion of that region. And so I think there is an amount of interesting material within Arthurian legend that is valid. And of course, the primary hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. Again, this links us back with Judea. It links us with the 1st century, which is a bit incongruous, really, when we're talking about a King Arthur, but that's what the story says. And we have the other heresy of some of these Arthurian manuscripts, where they directly say that Arthurian legend, the first manuscript of Arthurian legend, was written by Josephus Flavius. And of course, this is derided as being a complete nonsense, because you can't have Josephus Flavius talking about a 6th century king in Britain. And so it's disregarded. But for many reasons, I link this story back to the Arthurian story, back to the gospel story, because the hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. Anyway, that is all an introduction. The bit we want to talk about here is that Merlin and the Grail, which is one of these manuscripts of Arthurian legend, says that Joseph of Arimathea was a knight working for Emperor Vespasian for 7 years. So here we have this hero figure who comes out at the end of the gospel story and takes Jesus down from the cross, which, as I've said before, you're supposed to know exactly who this guy is because he comes without introduction, and yet nobody seems to know who he is, why he's there, how he has this authority to take someone down from the cross. And he's just there at the end of the story and nobody can make sense of it. Well, Arthurian legend says that Joseph of Arimathea was a knight working for Vespasian, and he had been for 7 years. Okay, so who was the Jewish knight who was working for Vespasian in the sort of gospel era, this later gospel era, in the Jewish revolt era? He was Josephus Flavius. He was a knight, he was an army commander working for Vespasian during the Jewish revolt. And he probably had been working for Vespasian as a spy ever since he went to Rome and saw Nero in AD 62, 63. So yes, he had been a knight working for Vespasian for 7 years. And again, this makes sense of the story that Joseph of Arimathea was Josephus Flavius. But of course, no Christian would want to admit that because Josephus Flavius was such a slippery, slimy character. He's what I call the Quicksilver quilled quisling, because he was a traitor. He changed sides. He started working for the Romans. Nobody would want Josephus Flavius as being Joseph of Arimathea, one of the heroes of the gospel story. And nobody would want him to be Saul, who wrote most of the Bible, most of the New Testament. And so by all means, they had to separate these characters out and never mention that Saul was Josephus Flavius. And that's exactly what they have done. But if you make this conflation, well, the other problem, of course, is that if you make this conflation, the gospel accounts have to be from the AD 60s, not the AD 30s. Because Josephus Flavius was only born in AD 37. And so it has to be a later story. This chronological chasm, as I call it, has to be real. In fact, that's how I first saw that the chronological chasm must exist, because I realized that Saul must be Josephus. And if you do that, then Jesus must have been alive in the AD 60s, and the whole of the gospel events must have happened in the AD 60s. And so people have to reject that completely because it disagrees with the Catholic narrative. You can't have this. And the last one I really want to go through here, and I'm going to have to actually take a quote here because I can't remember exactly what it says, is this late date. This conflation and this late date explains some of the things that the New Testament is talking about. And one of the things I like about this, because remember, if we're conflating Saul with Josephus Flavius, this is all about the Jewish revolt, because Josephus Flavius was the army commander in command of Galilee for the Jewish authorities, who surrendered to Rome and became a Roman army commander working for Vespasian and Titus. So this is all about the Jewish revolt era. That's the whole point of Josephus Flavius's life, really. And of course, we have this strange parable in the gospel story about the vineyard owner. And it's not very long, so I can read it out. This comes from the Gospel of Matthew. This is Matthew 21:33. And it says, there was a lord, a landowner, basically. There was a lord who planted a vineyard and let it out to a tenant and went to a far country. But when the might receive his rent. But the tenant took his servants and beat one and killed another and stoned another. So when the Lord, the landowner, therefore of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenants? Well, he'll miserably destroy those wicked men. And he will let out his vineyard to another tenant who will pay their rent. So what is this meaning? Why was Jesus promoting the right of absentee landlords to get their rent? And not only do that, but kill the tenants if they don't pay their rent. You know, the Jesus character was supposed to be this who was standing up for the rights of the workers, you know. He was the original communist, sort of standing up for the workers. So why is he supporting the rights of absentee landlords? Makes no sense in the traditional interpretation of who Jesus was and Saul was. But it makes every sense if Saul was Josephus, and therefore we put this story back into the Jewish revolt era. And what this parable is talking about is it's talking about Romans in Jewish lands, in Edessan lands, no less. And it's talking about the rights of kings. So what it's saying, all we need to do to understand this particular parable is we change the landlord into an Edessan monarch, and we change the tenant into a Roman. So now let's read it again with those two amendments. And what it says is, there was an Edessan king who had lands in Judea, and he let it out to the Romans and went into a far country. He went back to Edessa. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants to the Romans that he might receive his rent, his tribute for his lands. But the Romans took his servants and beat one and killed another and stoned another. So when the Edessan king of these lands comes, what will he do unto these Romans? He will miserably destroy these wicked Romans and will let out his lands unto another tenant who will pay their rent or tribute. Now it sort of makes sense. What's it talking about? This entire parable is a justification for starting a war with Rome. The Romans were on Edessan lands and they weren't paying their rent. Indeed, the Romans were doing quite the reverse. They were asking for rent from the Edessans for staying on their lands. And so this was a justification for starting a war with Rome, because Rome was not paying its dues for being on Edessan lands. And this was in the AD 60s. This is what Josephus Flavius is talking about. And so if we manage to conflate Saul with Josephus, all of this makes sense. Whereas in the gospel interpretation of the AD 30s, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so I think that is a good test of a theory. You know, if your theory can now make sense of the inexplicable, I think you're onto something. And this is just not one comparison between two characters. It's a dozen dozen reason for a conflation between these two characters. And it's a dozen reasons why this makes sense of the gospel story, which did not make sense before. So I think this is a true interpretation of what happened. You know, the gospel was an AD 60s story about the Jewish revolt.
Thank you, Ralph.